Hello, this is Chaoren, and welcome to another tutorial. Today we'll take a peek at the bosses of Karazhan. There really aren't a lot of guides for these fights since the content is a bit dated, and I thought players who weren't steeped in TBC raiding might want a tutorial to the entry raid of the expansion. This guide is designed to give you an overview of the raid generally and the basics of each encounter so that you can go in as a fresh 70 and not mess up. First off, you should know that on fresh servers like Warmane, you're probably going to need to be attuned. They removed this requirement later in the expansion. However, since it's still in effect here on Warmane, we're going to cover it. You can do the initial quests right outside of Karazhan, located between Duskwood and Stoner. I'd recommend picking them up as you level, since they give great experience. Once you complete the short quest chain, which involves going into 2 caves and then heading over to Aran, you'll be directed to Shattrath and asked to recover some key fragments. The first is in Shadow Labyrinth, the second and third are in Steam Vaults and Alcatraz. You can do these quests either on normal or heroic difficulty in the dungeons. Once you finish these quests, you'll be sent to Black Morass, and you can talk to Medivh, and finally you'll be attuned. Karazhan is a 10-player raid. You will typically bring 2 tanks, 2 healers, and 6 DPS. However, an overgeared raid can make do with a single healer, and many fights can be easily solo tanked. So it's nice having someone who can switch back and forth between tank and DPS. The difficulty of this raid is similar to a 5-man heroic dungeon. It's not particularly difficult. The first encounter is the animal bosses at the Servants' Quarter. However, we're going to skip through it because no one does it and most people don't even count it as a boss. The first boss we will cover is Attumen. It's easiest to use 2 tanks for this fight. Initially you'll just have Midnight, the horse. Both Midnight and Attumen are taunt immune. You begin the fight by pulling the horse, Midnight. Once the horse gets to 95%, the boss will appear. They both need to be tanked, and the trick to this is that you pick up the boss and the horse quickly so that it doesn't one-shot a healer. During the first phase, you'll have to deal with the damage that Midnight does, plus Attumen does a cleave and a curse that affects your chance to hit. Only the tank should stand in front of Attumen, and you can either reflect or dispel the curse that he does. Once either one of them gets to 25% health, Attumen will mount Midnight, and you'll begin the second phase of the fight. Typically, you bring Midnight to 25%. You could deal damage to Attumen instead, which would reduce the time you spend in phase 2. However, Attumen has a lot more health, so this takes longer than if you burn down Midnight. In phase 2, Attumen will only gain 1 new ability, and you won't have to deal with Midnight's damage anymore. So it's best to just burn Midnight down quickly and push phase 2. Be careful with Rhett, as his aggro table will reset during this transition. The new ability he gains is a charge. He'll charge whichever player is furthest from the boss. Simply have your off tank stand at range and absorb the charge, and you can burn the boss down in no time. Next, we'll move on to Moroes. This fight is all about crowd control. There will be 4 ads that you have to handle in addition to the boss. They are random and will vary between different raid IDs. The different ads are listed here. As you can see, there will be a variation of paladins, warriors, and priests. The strategy your raid uses will vary depending on your raid composition. Make sure you clear the entire room so you have plenty of room to move around. But be careful not to stand on the table, as it will create line of sight issues for your healers. Various forms of CC work well in this fight. Priests can shackle, hunters can use freezing trap, paladins you can use fear undead. You can also tank the ads. Kill the ads you can't CC, then kill the boss, then kill whatever's left alive. The boss himself is taunt immune. This is important because he also does a gouge on the tank. Once this happens, he will run over and begin attacking whoever is second on threat. This means that it's imperative that the off tank has secondary aggro. He also does a blind on whoever is closest to him, besides his current target. Make sure that one of our melee is right on top of him so that he doesn't cast blind on the off tank and gouge on the main tank. That means he would run over to presumably a healer or a DPS, and that will probably result in a wipe. Lastly, He will vanish and garrote a random player every 30 seconds. Garrote can be removed by Paladin Bubbles, Ice Block, or the Dwarf Racial Stone Form. Hunter should be able to feign death while he is vanished, and he shouldn't attack them. If you have a Paladin in the group, make sure they use Blessing of Protection on whoever gets the first garrote and save their Divine Shield for themselves. This will make life a lot easier for your healers. The longer Moroes is alive, the more garrotes that you will have to heal through. Once again, the way you deal with this mechanic will largely depend on your raid composition, and there are several ways that you can successfully cope with it. The trick to this fight is in formulating a smart strategy based upon your raid comp and expertly maintaining your crowd control. Note that you will not be able to loot the boss until both the boss and all his adds are dead. The next boss is the Maiden of Virtue. She is also taunt immune. There are no phases, just a few simple mechanics. Anyone in melee range of her will have to deal with a Consecrate-like effect she does, which will also do a periodic silence. This means that casters must stand at range outside of her AoE. She also does a periodic repentance, stunning the whole raid. Only Divine Shield and Ice Block can remove this stun. However, any damage taken will break it automatically. This means that anyone standing in Consecrate will be immediately freed from it, and Paladins using Blessing of Sacrifice can also free themselves even if they are at range, such as a Holy Paladin. She also uses Holy Fire, which is a magic effect and should be immediately dispelled. Lastly, she does an ability called Holy Wrath, which jumps from one player to the next. You can't do much if it lands in melee, and it is totally random, but range can mitigate it by spreading out around the perimeter of the room. You only need one tank for this fight. Position her in the middle of the room where she stands. Range spread out around the outer edge. Someone should be assigned to dispel the Holy Fire as soon as possible. Other than Holy Fire killing raid members, the only other significant threat is that your tank will take too much damage during a repentance while the healers are stunned. You can deal with this in a number of ways. One is for your tank to use defensive cooldowns when repentance hits. Another is to make sure that you have plenty of hots on the tank before it goes out. You can also have a Holy Paladin use Blessing of Sacrifice, as previously mentioned, so they are not stunned. If Sacrifice is on cooldown, remember Divine Shield also works. You could let a Feral Druid or an Enhancement Shaman in melee use a quick off heal, or, lastly, you could break the stun using her own Consecrate. This could be done either by having the tank drag the boss to the healer, or by having the healer jump into Consecrate prior to the repentance going out. Either way, I don't really recommend this last method, because the healer will be temporarily silenced, but it is an option. As long as you can keep the tank up through repentance and dispel the Holy Fire, this fight is fairly simple and should be an easy kill for your raid. The next encounter is the Opera event. Similar to how the adds with Moroes will vary from one raid ID to the next, the entire Opera event will vary. There are 3 possibilities, and we'll talk about each one. We will begin with the encounter shown, Wizard of Oz. This fight revolves around the raid's ability to kite or disable the mini-bosses until they can be killed before facing the final boss. They will be engaged one at a time. Dorothy should be the first to die since she can't be controlled and doesn't have an aggro table. Just nuke her down. She'll summon Tito, her dog. If you kill the dog before her, she will enrage, so just make sure to kill her first. Then kill the dog, which a tank can pick up. Roar is the cowardly lion. You can use Fear or Scare Beast, either one works just fine. Keep him feared until you're ready to kill him, then let a tank pick him up. He does hit pretty hard. The Straw Man is susceptible to fire damage. It will disorient him for 6 seconds. Literally any fire ability works great for this, so a mage, a warlock, a shaman, or even a caster with fire damage on their wand can keep him CC'd. Tin Head needs to be picked up by the main tank. As the encounter goes on, he will begin to rust and can easily be kited by the tank. You don't CC him. Once it begins to rust, he moves slowly and the tank will take very little damage. Once all these adds are dead, the crone will engage and you'll begin the last part of the fight. She summons tornadoes that knock players into the air, and I think it's easiest to see where they are if you face your camera straight down. but even then it's not always possible to avoid them, and you can get pinned in. Just burn the boss and you've got a kill. One of the other two possibilities for the opera event is Romulo and Julianne. You begin this fight in phase 1 with Julianne. You should interrupt as many of her spells as you can, but especially her heal. It's called Eternal Affection, and it heals her for approximately 50,000 health. Curse of Tongues does not work. If she casts Devotion, you will need to dispel it. Dispel Magic works, Devour Magic works, Purge works, and the best thing to do is Dispel Steal. Try to kill her on one side of the room so that it's easier to pick her up in phase 3. Once she dies, you begin phase 2 and Romulo will come. While she's a caster, he is the melee type. Fight him on the opposite side that she died on, and you want to fight him so that you are facing the wall and the boss has his back to the wall. This will make it easier for your melee because he does a knockback. You can disarm him, and you should try to do so when he gets the Daring debuff, which can and should be dispelled just like Julianne's Devotion. Once he dies, both he and Julianne will revive, and you begin the final phase of the fight. In phase 3, you have to fight them both, so you need to make sure you divide your raid group up appropriately. Both bosses must die within 10 seconds of one another, or else they will both revive at full health. You can either split your damage evenly and burn them down slowly, or else you can burn one down to about 5 or 10% and then retarget to the next one. It's up to you. Make sure you continue to interrupt casts and dispel their buffs. The final possibility for Opera is called the Big Bad Wolf. This is probably the simplest fight. He really only has 2 abilities. I think he does a cleave or a swipe or something like that, but there are no phases to this fight. Every 30 seconds or so, he'll fear the raid, and other than that, he will transform one raid member into Little Red Riding Hood. When that happens, the player loses armor and can't attack, but they run 50% faster. He'll chase that player down until the debuff wears off. Tank the boss on one side of the room, and you'll have the raid group up on the far side so that they have more time to crack the boss. Fear Ward or Tremor Totem work great against fear, and warriors can stand stance. When he transforms one of the raiders, that player should run around the outside edge of the room, and healers should spam heals on them. Rogues can vanish, hunters can feign death, paladins can use Blessing of Protection, arcane mages can use Slow, which is actually the only ability that will work to slow him down. After you finish with Opera, the next boss you might be able to kill is Nightbane. I say might be able to kill because this boss is optional and it requires at least one member of your raid to have done the quest chain for the urn. Nightbane is, in my opinion, the most challenging boss in Karazhan. You only need one tank for this boss. His fight alternates between 2 phases. In the first phase, the ground phase, you will deal damage to the boss to bring his health down by 25%. Once that happens, he will go up into the air, in the air phase, and you will have to deal with the breath attack and a few adds before he lands again, and you bring him down another 25%. You will do this 4 times until he dies. While in phase 1, which is with him on the ground, you'll have to deal with a few abilities. For one, he does an AoE fear. If you stand at max range, some casters and healers can stay outside of its effect, though this is not always possible as you may run into line of sight issues. Tremor Totem, Stance, Fear Ward, Will of the Forsaken, and PvP trinkets all work to break out of fear. Also, like a normal dragon, he does a frontal cleave, a breath attack, and a tail swipe. You should not stand in front or behind the boss, unless you're a tank. Lastly, the other main mechanic of this phase is Charred Earth. This will appear on the ground underneath a random raid member. It can target anyone, even the tank. Don't stand in it, as that can be very taxing for your healers, who will be busy healing the tank. Your number 1 priority is to stay out of Charred Earth. If you get feared into Charred Earth, be ready with some kind of defensive cooldown and move out of it ASAP. The graphic on the ground can be a bit misleading, so pay attention to your debuffs. If the tank gets charred earth, they will need to run straight through the middle of the boss and flip him around. They can't turn the boss, or he will either breath or tail swipe the raid, so you have to run right through the middle and flip him 180 degrees. Once he goes up into the air, the whole raid needs to group up on the south side of the platform, away from where the boss landed, and stack on each other. When he's up in the air, he'll cast a few spells and do some damage to the raid, dispel the debuffs, kill the adds, and heal up. He'll land once he's done casting his spells, and the tank should head back over to where he lands. Don't pre-hot, and let the tank pick it up. He will reset aggro every time he lands. This fight is a bit of a marathon unless you're over-geared for it. Do what you can to help your healers conserve mana by avoiding damage, using defensive cooldowns, and being smart with your innervates. Next, we're going to go ahead and move on to Curator. This boss is mandatory if you want to progress further into the raid. His fight consists of 2 phases. In the first, he will summon astral sparks that should be focused and killed as quickly as possible. Each astral flare costs him 10% of his mana. Once he summons 10, he will evocate. While he does this, he will restore his mana to full, but also takes increased damage. He hits for about 3,000 per strike on a tank, and will also use an ability called Hateful Bolt every 10 seconds or so on whoever has secondary aggro, with around 5,000 to 6,000 damage per strike. You don't need 2 tanks, 1 is sufficient. The main reason you'll wipe here is that your DPS aren't killing the astral sparks fast enough. You must focus them down quickly. Save your big cooldowns for evocate, during which you will do 2 times normal damage. I like to time it so that my Curse of Doom goes off during evocate, especially since you don't need Curse of the Elements on the boss while you have astral sparks alive. At 15%, the boss will go into a Soften Rage and you begin phase 2. During this phase, the boss will deal more damage, but he won't summon any more astral sparks. This is just the burn phase. Tanks should save cooldowns for this part, you just burn him down. After Curator, the next boss I recommend is Shade of Aran. Technically, Illhoof is closer, but by killing Shade, you can teleport up to his library in the event of a wipe, which could potentially save you a lot of time. This boss is great if you are a physical damage dealer, as he has very low armor. You don't need any tanks for this boss, provided you have someone that can control the adds he summons. He casts several spells, none of which can be outranged, but nearly all of which can be interrupted. Also, while interrupts work, Mind Numbing, Curse of Tongues, and Silence do not work. Casters need to stay away because he will do a counterspell to anyone within 10 yards of him. Most of his spells aren't that big of a deal, but there are 3 that you can interrupt and have to pay attention to. The first is Blizzard. It rotates clockwise around the room, just get behind it and avoid the damage. It's not like a normal mage's Blizzard. The second is Flame Wreath. It affects random raid members. If you move in or out of Flame Wreath, it does a ton of damage and will toss you up into the air. When he casts Flame Wreath, just stand still and don't move until it's gone. It's that easy. The third thing he does is a combination of an AoE pull, a slow, and an arcane explosion. When everyone gets pulled into the middle of the room, run to the edge as fast as you can. You can dispel the slow effects. You don't want to get hit by an arcane explosion. At 40%, the boss will summon elementals. There are 4 of them. You can banish them, fear them, you can tank them, etc. And they despawn after 90 seconds. The choice of how to deal with them is yours. The last ability he uses is one I don't have video for, and you're only going to see it if you have a very low damage raid. He gets to 20% mana, he's going to use Polymorph on the whole raid, drink some water, and then do a Pyroblast to everybody in the raid. While you can break out of Polymorph by using some class abilities, you shouldn't, since it will regenerate both health and mana while polymorphed, and Pyroblast isn't going to kill you. Just let him do his thing. Let's see, next we'll move over to Terestian Illhoof. He's located behind a secret passage down a ramp. You can do this fight with either 1 or 2 tanks, and depending on how good your DPS is, it might be a long fight. In addition to the boss, you also have a demon to contend with, named Kil'rek. If you kill Kil'rek, he will respawn after 45 seconds. It's best to go ahead and kill him, since that gives you time to burn the boss without his added damage, provided you can do so quickly. Illhoof will also summon imps that can be AoE down, ideally by a warlock, maybe a mage. They don't hit that hard, so they aren't a big priority. Your number one priority in this fight is the demonic chains. Periodically, Illhoof will cast Sacrifice on a player, excluding the tank, and that player will be encircled by demonic chains that will take damage and heal Illhoof every second that the demonic chains are alive. It is absolutely paramount that you kill the demonic chains as soon as they appear. Mages can ice block, while sacrificed to get rid of the demonic chains, and paladins can use their bubble. Druids should use bark skin. While a macro might help you target the demonic chains faster, it's not really necessary. You just target it and attack. We'll move on now to Netherspite. This is another optional boss, and a bit of a gear check, similar to Nightbane. You will need 2 tanks for this boss, and there are 2 phases to this fight. Phase 1 lasts for 60 seconds, and Phase 2 lasts for 30 seconds. During Phase 1, he will summon 3 portals. Initially, they will always spawn in the same location, but then after that, for each successive spawn, it will be random. Each portal shoots a beam directly towards the boss, which gives both a buff and a debuff. The trick is for players to intercept these beams by standing between the boss and the portal. After standing in a beam, you'll get a debuff and can't stand in it again for 60 seconds. So you need to alternate players. Before we talk about the portals, let's first talk about the boss's basic abilities. First off, he does an AoE called Netherburn. It's shadow damage and it is resistible, so use the Shadow Resistance Aura or Prayer of Shadow Protection. He also casts Void Zones on the ground at the feet of random raid members. Just don't stand in it. But if you're intercepting a portal, you'll need to make sure that you move forwards or backwards, as moving side to side might put you out of the beam prematurely. He's a bit odd as far as dragons go in WoW, because he does neither a cleave nor a tail swipe. Now, let's talk about the different beams. The red one is the tanking beam. You can jump in and out of this one, as it lasts for 20 seconds. If it hits Netherspite, it will reduce his damage taken by 1% for every second he stands in the beam. On a player, it will cause Netherspite to aggro to you, as well as reducing your damage taken by 1% per tick, increasing your defense by 1% per tick, and increasing your health by initially 31,000 before reducing it by 1,000 per tick after that initial buff. The green beam is for healers or melee DPS. If it hits Netherspite, it will heal him for a growing amount. You do not want to let him get hit with a green beam. Players in the green beam will do 5% more healing per tick, abilities will cost 1% less per tick, and mana will be replenished to full. But mana will also be reduced by 200 per tick. Rage and energy are not affected by the green beam, but abilities that use rage and energy are. The blue beam is for your casters. If the blue beam hits Netherspite, he will gain 1% spell damage per tick. A player intercepting the beam will do 5% more damage per tick, but will take 1% less healing, 8% increased damage per tick as well. After 60 seconds of Phase 1, he will become banished and go into Phase 2 for 30 seconds. Unlike when a mob is normally banished, you can still attack him and he can attack you, but he will remain rooted in place. He won't do Netherburn anymore, but he will still melee anyone close to him. He will also target a random player and try to cast Nether Breath on them, which has a 60-yard range and affects targets in a cone. Simply spread out. If you are low on health, you can just stand farther than 60 yards away, and he won't be able to attack you. There are multiple strategies for this boss. The red beam can either be tanked by multiple players during Phase 1, or one tank can move in and out of that so that they don't get too many stacks. If you use multiple players, they should have a good amount of armor. Even with the buff that the beam gives, the boss hits really hard. You don't need to actually be a tank. Anyone with high armor can do it, but being a tank helps a lot. Tanks who jump in and out of the beam will need to make sure they don't stay out for more than a few seconds so they don't get the debuff, which won't allow them to intercept the beam anymore. The green beam can be tanked by a healer, but is often better to just let a rogue or warrior tank it. The beam doesn't hurt them, and they can spam their attacks. Whoever isn't taking the boss can pick this beam up, no problem. The biggest thing to remember is that the green beam can't touch the boss. It will likely result in a wipe if it does. The blue beam should be taken by a caster. It helps if they have shadow resistance, but it's not needed. Shadow priests should avoid using Shadow Word Death, as they can easily kill themselves with it. And warlocks should not life tap with too many stacks for the same reason. Both of these classes are great for the blue beam because of their self-healing abilities. If you want to play it safe, you can split the blue beam between 2 casters per phase, needing 4 total casters to rotate in and out of it. But if your healers are good and players can avoid damage, you can just tank the blue beam for the entire phase. You should have a healer dedicated to healing the blue beam players. The whole gimmick for this fight is intercepting the beams and running out during the banish phase. However you decide to set up your beam intercepts, and there are multiple viable options. Just make sure that everyone clearly knows what their role is, and you react quickly if a player assigned to a beam dies or gets nether exhaustion. Next, we'll move on to the chess event. This is a very different kind of fight because your gear is totally irrelevant and you don't use any of your normal abilities. Instead, you possess pieces on a chessboard and play against the opposing faction. It's not exactly like chess because the pieces don't behave the same way and you don't take turns moving, but it's similar. There really isn't one strategy to use, and I think all I'm going to do here is just give you a short overview. As with chess, the fight is over when the king dies. Your king does a lot of damage and has a lot of health. The queen also does a lot of damage. The bishops are your healers. They deal a small amount of damage, but mainly they heal. Knights, rooks, and pawns are mostly just filler. Medivh cheats, so there's that. He either heals his units to full health, puts fire under your units, or he'll give some of his units a speed and damage buff. There's not much you can do about the heal, but for the kite or the fire, just make sure you move appropriately, just move out of it. This fight's really easy, so we're going to go ahead and move on to the last boss, which is Prince Malchezaar. There are 3 phases to this fight. You only need 1 tank. During the whole encounter, he will summon Infernals from the sky, which land on the platform and do AoE damage. They don't move, so just don't stand near them. If they land on a tank, you'll need to adjust. He also does a knockback, so tank him with your back to the wall so you can stay in one spot. During phase 1, he uses an ability called Enfeeble. It drops your health to 1 and is followed shortly by a Shadow Nova, which is what does the knockback. You can't heal Enfeeble targets, nor can you dispel the debuff. Any damage taken will kill you, so you must avoid the Shadow Nova. If you tank the boss, as we have him positioned here, there is a spot along the wall where you can line of sight the Nova and survive without having to run all the way out. He will also cast Shadow Word Pain on the tank. You can dispel it. At 60%, he will move into phase 2. At this time, he swaps to using axes and will parry and use Sunder Armor on the tank. You have to really be careful about the effect of parry haste during this phase. If you're worried about your tank surviving, take your time in phase 1 so that you don't have to worry about aggro in phase 2 and can stop attacking so they don't die to parry haste. During phase 2, he will continue to use Enfeeble and summon Infernals and use Shadow Nova. At 30% health, he will enter phase 3, the final phase of the fight. The tank damage will be similar to what it was in the first phase, and he won't use Enfeeble, Sunder Armor, or parry anymore. He will resume casting Shadow Word Pain, and will now also cast Amplify Magic as well. He summons axes that will attack random players, and he summons Infernals more quickly. This is your burn phase. Push DPS. A few things to remember during this fight. Be really careful with Shadow Word Death and Seal of Blood. If you use this with Enfeeble, you'll kill yourself. Elixir of Demon Slaying is great for this fight. Be flexible with positioning. As we said earlier, if the Infernal falls on the tank, you'll have to reposition on the fly. The Infernal locations are random. And that concludes this video. Hopefully, you found it helpful. As I said at the beginning, there are some details that I skipped over, as this is only meant to be a general overview for the uninitiated. If you would like to add additional tips for new players, I encourage you to write a comment below. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.